The year is 1981, and legendary madman John Boorman brings us an adaptation of Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. The film blends mysticism and medieval brutality in a stylized retelling of King Arthur's rise, the forging of the Round Table, and the eventual fall of Camelot. Boorman's direction leans into surreal, dreamlike imagery, creating an atmosphere that feels both ancient and fantastical. With an all-star cast including Nigel Terry as Arthur, Nicol Williamson as the tormented Merlin, and Helen Mirren as Morgana, the film brings intensity and depth to the mythical characters. Excalibur is not a conventional fantasy film. It's poetic, it's violent, and deeply symbolic, exploring themes of power, destiny, and human frailty, cementing it as a cult classic of epic proportions. But is it for all tastes? Tonight we discuss John Boorman's Excalibur. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. So the first thing I gotta say about this film is I'm gonna go ahead and say that it is not for everybody. At least that's what I thought. Because when I go and I look at Rotten Tomatoes, it's got an 80% of audience score and a 73% of critic score. And IMDb, it's got a 7.3. So people like this movie, but then when I speak to people face to face, they just don't get it. So what camp are you in?
I don't like it. I hated it. Now, in fairness, this is one, just like we talked about war movies, I'm not into. In books, I love the medieval story, but in movies, I can appreciate the visual, but the storytelling, it's a hit or miss for me if they can do it right. Here, they don't do it right because the critic in me just goes over the horrible editing, the overall editing missteps where we have Merlin with his metal helmet in 1 second and then he misses it in the second. This is a movie that has so many missteps that I spent the rewatch picking and nitpicking everything that went wrong in the filmmaking process. Now, I can appreciate the story. I can appreciate what it's trying to do. I love the lore of it. But when it comes to a technical aspect, if you take away the visuals that are at times appeasing, it is an absolute mess. There was one moment in this movie that I had to turn it off, walk away, and come back. And it's during a scene where we have that breastfeeding scene. And there was a transitional moment where it sounded like somebody squeaked a rubber ducky in a transition while they were breastfeeding. And I'm like, how was this even missed in the filmmaking process? This is absolutely Monty Python Holy Grail comedic at times. And given that we have uncredited writing credit from somebody from Monty Python here, but I was getting the vibes of that at times. The dialogue is just so limp. It's so stale. It's so segmented where we have to almost feel like we're on stage where we deliver a line, pause 2 seconds, deliver a line. And they try to be Shakespearean with it, and it just comes across as laughable. And the pauses between the dialogue justify the runtime. Speed the hell up and be realistic. Those are my first thoughts.
I mean, I figured that this was not going to be a Justin movie, and I was prepared for that debate. It's why I'm not a critic, because I just really, really am captured by this movie. Now, I like it. Is it entertaining? I don't think so. I think it is immersive. And this is an era of movies just like this. Movies like Krull, movies like Dragon Slayer, the fantasy films of the early 80s. They might have been great in the trailer, where they looked exciting, they looked energetic, they looked maybe scary and frightening. But then when you play the film, they're actually very esoteric, right? And this is probably the most esoteric of them. But it goes back to my little synopsis. John Boorman is a madman. You know, he knocked it out of the park with Deliverance, but go back and watch Deliverance and realize that the excitement of Deliverance is probably 5 minutes of the movie, right? It's the first scene, it's the kidnap scene, it's maybe John Voight scaling the hill, and then the rapids, right? Everything in between that is kind of an exercise in the immersion of nature and terror of this tribe of dudes that are after our heroes. But then you look at movies like Zardoz, which is even more bonkers than this. There's just something about this filmmaker. I'm going to put him on the kind of the same lines as Nicholas Roeg and Donald Cammell and Ken Russell, where it's not as much a narrative story as it is an experience. And that's how I feel about this movie. Nothing is conventional about the filmmaking in this. It's hazy. It's almost like they shot it through a pair of pantyhose like they did with Fiddler on the Roof, right? There's like this mist that's ever present. There's a green glow on everything. They had green lighting in the forest. They have green harsh lighting bouncing off these suits of armor and Excalibur. And you're right, the acting from the main characters is more like someone just reciting poetry than it is performing. But the performances of Merlin and Morgana, who are like our heavies in this movie, I feel they are intentionally hammy and overacted to overcompensate the, let's say, poetic dreamscape that Boorman's trying to create with the other characters. Does it work for just the average viewer? I don't think so. I think it works for people like me who get entranced by this kind of filmmaking. So while I will definitely say that it's not for everybody, it's definitely in my wheelhouse.
I think when we get into the second half of the movie, it actually finds its forte and it actually does ground itself, and it does feel better than the first half, because I go back to the first half where this movie just doesn't know what it wants to be. It's trying to find its footing. We get a scene with Merlin who, and again, this is a point where Justin had to walk off and just say, give me a break, is when he's in a river looking for a fish and he just falls backwards in an attempt to be comedic, goofy. I don't know what the intent is, but that is my frustration with this movie, is it tries experimental things with its cast to try and find its footing on how it wants to portray what this movie is. But when we get into the second half, I found myself engulfed in it. I actually did enjoy it when things started to happen, where it became something that it knew what it wanted to be. But it feels like they were trying to figure out as they went of what the tone is going to be, what the characters are going to be. We don't get a clear direction on what these characters are, especially with the Merlin, which I know our critics are going to speak to it, and I'm going to disagree with it, is there is no consistent direction for these characters. And I didn't even get buy into the Merlin character until we see Helen Mirren start interacting with him. But even then, it's a big question mark on how I should feel about Merlin. And he is the biggest aspect of not only the lore, but this movie. If anything was taken out of this movie, it should be how Merlin is portrayed. And I went back to Sam Neill's portrayal in a TV, the Merlin version, which was fantastic. And that one, I compared it to.
I got it on DVD.
It's a fantastic miniseries.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it really does have to have a footing of clarity of how you want these characters to go. If you're going to tackle something about the Knights of the Round Table and Merlin, you have to have a clear direction, if anything, of these characters, which this movie, in my opinion, did not.
What it feels like to me is I feel like this movie was supposed to be Arthur's movie, but Nicol Williamson is just so magnetic that he kind of started taking the movie away from everyone else, and Boorman recognized that in the performance and started just giving Merlin more to do. And then Morgana comes in, and it's Helen Mirren, who's beautiful and just so magnetic in this movie. She almost saves the movie, the same way I feel like she saves Caligula. Like her and Malcolm McDowell save that movie. She does the same here, where she just brings this crazy performance, and she's so seductive, not just to the people in the film, but to the viewer, that it really just becomes her movie for a while too. that it distracts us from what this movie is supposed to be, the Knights of the Round Table and Arthur. And I'm going to give you 100% credit on that. Nigel Terry is boring as Arthur. There's no magnetism to him. But at the same time, I feel like that's also intentional because Guinevere doesn't really like him, right? She loves the idea that he's king, and she says that. She's like, I loved you as a king, and I kind of loved you as a husband. She wants Lancelot. That's the classic story, and they've done that over and over again. In Camelot, they did it in First Knight, but in those, Arthur's charming. It's Sean Connery and Richard Harris. In this, Nigel Terry is just dull. But it makes me think that that was the point, is that this is a guy who never really should have been king to begin with. He's king because he pulled the sword from the stone because of lineage, not because of anything that he earned. Now, I think there's something really interesting in that storytelling in the original texts, but how it's translated here is that everybody around him respects him for being the king, but they all know that they're better than him, and I like that. All of his knights know that he's not the best leader. They all wish Lancelot was back, that Lancelot was there. But what it feels like is there's a lot more movie that was filmed, but edited out to consolidate the film. And when you say poor editing, I agree with you. The choices made in the cuts and the choices made in the transitions do create a very uneven storytelling. But it doesn't take away from me, at least, the immersive experience.
Yeah, and I'll go back to even the first half where we don't get a lot of time with Arthur to really build stake. It almost goes into that assumption. We already know the lore of this story. We already know who these characters are, and there's not a lot of depth going into it. I mean, we have Arthur that we get, 10 minutes, if that, of screen time before he's pulling the sword from the stone after about 30 minutes in. So there's not a lot of depth to it to really have us care about who Arthur is. And you're right. It's a Lancelot movie that the direction really does focus on him when he's on screen, to the point where we have that Guinevere Lancelot nude scene in the woods that made me feel cold because I couldn't relate to it. But when it comes to the build of it, we can care less about these characters. And when it comes to the editing, that's where we don't really get a focus. The editing tries to convince us that these characters are important, but subconsciously, we know these characters are important. Give us a reason of these cast members to be important in these roles. And I think that's what the biggest problem is with this, because like I said earlier, right when we get to the second half of it, we start getting zoomed in shot, less wide angle, less environment, and we get brilliant photography, these scenes that are just established, and we get these character focuses that I was like, aha, I care now. I care about these characters. I care about the stakes, but it took an hour and 45 minutes for us to even get there. But Helen Mirren, you're right, saves this movie, because right when she appears on screen, that's when I started to care. That's when there was some stakes built into it. That's where the performances felt natural, like it just flowed. And it almost was like the cast was going with Mirren in her performance and her portrayal. So it's almost like she held the torch and led the back half of this movie on what it should have been. If I were to say in our critics, if I were to get ahead of it, they are misguided on who the true winner here is. It is Helen Mirren, hands down.
For an Arthurian tale, it does spend a lot of time on Morgana and her son and the conquest for the Round Table, but instead of doing it in a narrative way, direct approach, they do it very performative, where there is a lot of slow fade camera transitions and a lot of glitter and a lot of mist. And I like that. And I wasn't even stoned when I watched this. I tell you what, it's great stoned. I guarantee you that. So I think that is one of the things where the interpretation, or let's say the expectation of what a movie like this is supposed to be, when a filmmaker decides to not go that direction, it can be offensive to a viewer. But what I don't get is, in this day and age where everyone is so excited to put their opinion online, to put their rating into Rotten Tomatoes and Letterboxd, and IMDb. How is this trending so high if so many people verbally say that they don't dig this movie, especially critics? It was kind of critically lambasted by the majority of mainstream critics. But then you go back and you look at Rotten Tomatoes, and a lot of the critics from like smaller publications and newspapers actually dug it. I'm going to compare it to Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate had the same thing, where now it's considered kind of like a cult masterpiece, but was an utter box office and critical failure on a mainstream level when it came out, but like the underground loved it. So there is something about movies like this that find an audience before video, where like people like really dug this movie, and then maybe they found it on video or cable. I mean, I grew up with it on TNT or AMC. Like it would just show up and I'd watch it. Like, oh, that's that cool Arthur movie. And it's dreamlike. And maybe that just is a triggering thing for me, where I will get hypnotized by a movie like this. And that is what I am giving my opinions and credibility towards, is the fact that it can draw me in like that without entertaining me as a narrative. And that's where like I said, I couldn't be a critic, because I can accept the fact that there's lots wrong with this movie, but I am literally drawn into it.
I'll go on the basis of, can I watch the second half of this movie over and over again? To an extent, I can. But when it comes to how this movie grows, and we're going to have movies time over time grow, especially when in the 80s, because we have Liam Neeson, that this was early in his career, Patrick Stewart, Helen Mirren,
Gabriel Byrne.
All these origin stories of this cast that actually Liam Neeson does a pretty decent job in the limited screen time he has. He's grisly, he's overly done, but I'll tell you what, I was drawn to him, and maybe it's just subconsciously I'm looking for Liam Neeson, but he does a great job in it too. So I think, and Patrick Stewart in the limited time, of course, a Shakespearean actor, he steals the show. So
you want more Patrick Stewart. Just like in Dune, just like in Life Force, you want more Patrick Stewart.
I want more Patrick Stewart. Make him Lancelot. I would have been attracted to him in that role versus any other person placed in that role. So you can never go wrong with more Patrick Stewart. But this is where it's trending, because we want to see where an actor or actress started. So, and it is interesting to see the evolution of this cast grow, because this one, there isn't horrible performances here. I think it's just horrible dialogue and what to do with it, especially if you have a new performance or a new actor, new actress trying to tackle this material. It's hard. It's hard to know the pacing without, a Patrick Stewart knowing with that Shakespearean background. So I think the dialogue here, if we close our eyes and listen, it's very straightforward. It's so segmented, and you know where the dialogue's going to go, where you hear the phrase, oh my lord, or my lord, once, and you never hear it again. So it's a very unbalanced script that we have presented here. And I think our cast, being young and unexperienced, don't know really what to do with it. And I think that's the main problem that we have. And our director really has to compensate with that in the back half of it with a lot of visuals. I think that's what adds to the engagement factor of why I was engaged with it, because it supplemented the lackluster dialogue that we have.
I'm glad you said that, because it was like literally walking me into my next point. There is this generation of British filmmaker that it's just like this. I already kind of said Nicholas Roeg, Donald Cammell, Ken Russell. These are guys that when you watch their films, the films are not about the dialogue. The dialogue isn't really what tells the story. The dialogue just kind of gets us from scene to scene. These are filmmakers that are obsessed with the set piece. They are obsessed with the dressing of the world they're creating. And then this movie's not the best at those edits or the way that the scene changes happen. But when you look at movies like Walkabout, or especially if you look at Nicholas Roeg's films like Don't Look Now, the dialogue doesn't matter. It is the environment. It is the tension created by the music. And again, he's using Wagner and opera music in this film that really works. If you look at Zardoz too, there's like a totemistic representation of statues and set pieces and gods, and that's all over this. When Morgana is in her lair, she has all of these deities behind her. There's faces in the walls. There's faces in the mist. There's the frozen encapsulations of these people in the cave. It's all about the environment. And so I think that if you are used to watching films by filmmakers like this, you are totally in for that ride. But it is something that you have to temper yourself in. Because I didn't like those movies when I was younger because I wanted Star Wars. I wanted Willow. I wanted action and adventure and characters and story. And then almost like a sommelier, getting the different notes and hints and the flavors of what a filmmaker is doing in the background. I think that is what I recognize and appreciate in these filmmakers. Because narratively, none of those movies make a goddamn lick of sense. But they have a following, and I think that's why.
Well, I think the main problem is when we go vice versa and we don't have engagement and start having those solid visuals toward the second half, that's when your eyes open and you start to look for flaws. There would be no argument with cinematographer Alex Thompson on the beauty of this movie.
Right.
It looks great. But what does boil down to it is the nitpicking of you have this golden set of armor that I can't go on a hike for 2 minutes without my shoes getting dirty, but they come through with shiny armor after about 4 months of travel. So there are details here that really do miss the boat, and it relies heavily on those visuals, on the set pieces, on the cinematography, that if this would have happened in the first half of the movie, it would have gained credibility to make us say in the second half, it's earned its right to be stupid. It's earned its right to be ridiculous. It's earned its right to have limited dialogue. But it's almost reverse, where when things start to happen, people say less, and that's when it actually is more engaging. In the beginning, we try and build this world, and it's just like, come on. I mean, we have the sex scene in the beginning that looks like the guy's having a seizure in armor. So there's a lot of these pieces of it that just lose credibility by the time the second half happens. And when it does happen, where we have that big chapel scenery with the blue light shining in and everybody bowed down, that was a pivotal moment that I got some buy-in saying, that looks cool. I'm going to give this movie another chance. And it didn't disappoint. It did give me that other chance, and it did make me forget a lot of these flaws from the first half of the movie. But this is why the runtime should have been shortened down to maybe a half hour less, had the cast speed up their lines, go to more depth, and have better transitions and better editing. And that would have added to the engagement here. But I get there's going to be a following because there's a following of this story. There's a following of these characters. There's a following of the lore. So this one is a safe bet when it comes to a cult following because this is a story that never gets old. You have that dedicated batch of followers that will take King Arthur's story and take away something. They relate to it. They relate to the morality of it. They relate to the legend of it. So when it comes to even IMDb, you will have those people following whatever King Arthur's movies are going into the next 10 to 20 years.
Or they're just fans of the filmmaker and they're, wanting him to play the hits, which he does in this movie to a fault. I'm not a huge fan of Peter Jackson's Return of the King. It's my least favorite of the 3 Lord of the Rings movies. But obviously, he loves this movie because he essentially took the ending and put it on his movie, as the legends go into the distance on the ship, essentially metaphorically. And that's what he does in the third one. I was like, oh, this is essentially the Return of the King ending. Anyway, that's just me kind of geeking out on the whole fantasy aspect of it. So let's go ahead and hear what our critics have to say about this. And you know what, man, they're kind of in your boat.
This has been a big week, though, for Epics, Gene, and here we have another one, Excalibur, a visually breathtaking version of the whole panorama of the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, including Merlin the Magician, Lancelot, Guinevere, and a sword called Excalibur. I stress the fact that Excalibur is visually beautiful because that's the movie's strong point. This movie is a feast for the eyes and a famine for the mind. It's great to look at, but you go crazy trying to figure it out. That's Nicol Williamson as Merlin the Magician and Helen Mirren as Morgana. and their relationship is the best one in the movie. Williamson plays Merlin as a sly, eccentric character who changes his mind and his magic from one day to the next. They're magnetic when they're on screen together, but the rest of the actors come over basically as dolts. I think you can see from both of the scenes we looked at that Excalibur is a great-looking movie, but unfortunately, the characters never really come alive except for Merlin and Morgana. The others seem doomed to perform disconnected, heroic gestures. They're brave and glorious one minute, the next minute they're all plotzed around the round table. The events in this movie don't develop, they passively unfold, so I'm in a dilemma. I love the way the movie looked, but I can't recommend the story.
Yeah, I mean, they're saying what you're saying, and I can't disagree with him on a critic's level. I can't disagree with him on an average movie goer's level. I'm pretty sure that if in 1981 I walked into a theater with my dad as, let's say, a 10-year-old, which I wasn't, I was born in 81, hypothetically, I'd probably be bored to death. It really is a slow movie, and he's right. But again, it's like, I'm not trying to defend the filmmaker. What I think is going on here is I really think that at the end of the day, this is Merlin and Morgana's movie, and they have to make Arthur and the Knights work around it. And that is the issue with the narrative of the film, is that the inconsistencies of Arthur and Guinevere and those characters, I think, are all at fault of the director and the editor as they try to make the most energetic moments of the movie between Merlin and Morgana work, and putting those in those spots of the movie where they have their little, tongue lashings at each other, and she's stealing his magic, and she traps him in the magic ice. What are the other characters doing? Not a lot. And you're right, that is a problem if you look at the movie as a narrative. And as a critic, I cannot disagree, because upon first watch, that is pretty much what it is. Dude, it's almost as if the best way to watch this movie the first time is, like I said, either stoned or impaired or half awake, where you don't start to analyze what the story is or what the dialogue is. You just kind of let it sweep over you like a blanket, and you just kind of wrap yourself up in it. I think that's the best way to appreciate this movie, because if you are watching it with an analytical eye, there is just way too much to pick apart.
Well, I don't know. I was about 4 bourbons in when I first started the rewatch on this one. And that's where...
I didn't say bourbon, dude. I said something else.
And I think that's where the flaws were. And in fairness, if I were to be open and honest, I haven't seen this in a decade. So going into it, I remember I didn't like it the first go around. So I went into the rewatch looking for flaws. And I want to be upfront with that. And it was more obvious with the flaws here. And I'm going to disagree with Roger. If I was walking in the 80s saying, wow, that looks great, maybe for 80s standards, I get it. But at the same time, what contributes to visual beauty of cinema? Is it just going to be the overall cinematography? Is it going to be the holistic aspect of transitions to one scene to another, including the cinematography? Because to me, it was so noticeable on the bad editing here that it took me out of the atmosphere. It took me out of the environment of what Thompson cinematography was supposed to do. So I can appreciate the cinematography. Do I think it's a beautiful movie that I'm going to spout off 2-3 times in a review? No, I will appreciate that. But at the same time, everything else has to coincide with it. It does have to take you into this fantasy world. It has to take you into this world. But that's why editing in movies is so important, because it takes one horrible transition, one horrible shot to take you out of this fantasy world. And that's what this movie does. So I can't agree with Roger to say it looks great, because it took me out of the fantasy.
And there's nothing wrong with that viewpoint of the movie, because I'm sure a lot of people share it. Let's hear what Gene has to say.
With you exactly. I did feel that these were a lot of people, modern characters walking around wearing costumes. You know, I never got the reality of this film, except, as you point out, particularly for me, Merlin, the character of Merlin. He's fascinating, he's electric, charming. I just can't understand why the director, John Boorman, who's made some pretty good films, Deliverance in particular, why he didn't make Lancelot, Guinevere, and Arthur more compelling characters. They're just interchangeable almost.
Sharply delineated characters. If you go back 14 or 15 years to Camelot, which was a movie I was not enthusiastic about, at least the characters were drawn with good brushstrokes. You could see who they were and how they related to each other. Here, as you mentioned, they're like mannequins wearing costumes, walking around in their armor in the river. Instead of romance, you want Rust-Oleum.
Yeah, it's a very unimpressive film from that aspect. Only Merlin seems to work.
Yeah, I mean, he's on the same page. So I think at the end of the day, you know, the initial reaction of critics for this movie was pretty consistent with them, that there's good things in this movie, but not enough to make it a good movie. And I think the subject matter has a lot to do with that. When you go and you watch an Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, I think you're expecting adventure. You're expecting high stakes. You're expecting sword fights and jousts and honor. And this movie has very little of all of that. It's more about reluctancy and envy of power and the end of mysticism. There is a lot of Lord of the Rings in here in the subtext of like, we are leaving the era of magic and dragons and wizards and witches and entering the era of men and kingdoms. They don't do a good enough job explaining that until the very end. But I think that's what the whole idea of this film is.
When it comes to the story of King Arthur, there is always a message, and you can just say the name King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and you kind of, even if you don't know the story, you're going to know kind of the bottom line message of it. But this is where, again, I'm going to agree to disagree with our critics. You know, when it comes to our Merlin character, it wasn't electric, it was boredom. So nobody knew what these characters were supposed to be. And he's right in this aspect. They are mannequins playing it, but I don't think that's a cast problem. I think it's a character direction problem. I think it's a dialogue problem. I think this cast was treated unfairly on how this movie should have portrayed. We can either have a message-heavy movie or we can have a blockbuster. This one sneaks its toes in between what it wants to be. It doesn't really know, so it kind of gives us a safe bet of in between. So it wants to deliver a message, but the dialogue doesn't really give us enough heavy context to show us what the messaging is, other than piggybacking off of what the assumption of what we already know about this already told, known story. So to me, I think it's a very safe movie about Excalibur and King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and I don't think it takes any risk. I think Boorman really doesn't show what he can potentially do other than play it safe. He's a fantastic filmmaker, but it's not shown here.
I mean, I think it does take a lot of risks by telling a very R-rated story about what's generally been told as a PG version, story. You're bringing sex and violence into this world that we mostly known through animation and musical, right? That's besides the point. I think what I can say closing off this conversation about this filmmaker and filmmakers like him is that they are the type of filmmakers that they are creating a world for these actors to play in. They are not drawing performances from actors to create the world around them. That's what filmmakers like Scorsese and Spielberg do, and they can still have a lot of visual flair, but they are wanting the performances to create the world, where there are filmmakers that are more visualists. I'm even say, to an extent, Kubrick was that way, which was why he was so aggressive with his actors. Essentially, Kubrick's style of directing was, don't fuck up my world that I built. You're going to do this take 100 times to get it right, because look how much time I spent building this world. Pay respect to my world. That's what I'm talking about. And you can tell that in this, he cares so much more about the world than he does the performances, that he doesn't have that Kubrick angst to him to make the performance match the world. And I think that's the difference between a filmmaker like Boorman and a movie like this than a movie like Barry Lyndon that Kubrick did. that's where I think the disconnect is Boorman cares more about the world than he does the characters.
And I can appreciate the appreciation for the world, but at the same time, if you don't have a vision to where these characters are going to take it,
it's not going to be a good movie for everybody.
100%. And you can turn off the volume and appreciate the visuals of it. And does it work for an 80s movie? Yes. Did it stay with current times? I say no, because you do see flaws in it. But this is something as a filmmaker that when you take a very fresh cast, you take a cast that you know is just going to be surface level, it's what you're going to do with it to complement this world. Because if you're looking past the cast and you're looking to the trees in the background, the mist, the waterfalls, the green hues on costumes, then you know you're not going to have a solid movie. So this is a responsibility of the director to know you have to build a world, and a world doesn't exist without people. It doesn't exist about how you're interacting in this atmosphere. And I think that's where the real miss was here. And I think the director is so much better than that. And I know that we have directors that get almost sideswiped by saying this shot looks great. We have directors that go more to the atmosphere than they do the people because that's their forte, that's their comfort zone. But this one is so obvious on, especially in the first half, how they don't interact. It's almost like a high school play, a dress rehearsal, delivering their lines. It's so segmented that it's hard to care about the characters at hand. And I think our critics said it best. They are mannequins, they're props. And we get that vibe within the first hour of the movie. And we have to sit through that and hope and cross our fingers that the second half gives us buy-in.
You know what would have made this movie better, in my opinion, is instead of having the score that they used with the Wagner intermittently peppered through the movie, is if this was like Rodney James Dio music. If it was some kind of fantastical heavy metal behind it, that almost would match the fantastical aesthetic that Boorman creates with these sets and these costumes. If you go back and you watch like old Judas Priest videos and old Dio videos, it almost feels like that. I think if they would have done something a little bit more modern like that, then it would have been an instantaneous cult classic on a higher level, because it would have played to the metal fantasy that was already so popular of this time. Again, that's just like a fantasy idea from me, but every time I was watching like the glowing swords and the green mist around those suits of armor, I almost wanted to hear Holy Diver play in the background, right? That's what it was saying to me. But again, that's just my fantasy.
Kind of like We Will Rock You in 2001's A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger. That's what it should have been. I would have totally been bought into that one. I would have loved that.
So as much as I enjoy and love this movie for what it is, I don't defend it against the naysayers, because there is a lot to naysay, 100%. So how do I feel about the critics' response? I can't disagree with them, because they are making very valid points. So that being said, with Gene, I'm going to have to give him a B, because if I'm thinking in the Justin parlance, that you want to tell your average audience whether or not this film is worth their money. Visually, I think it is, but it's not a popcorn movie. It's not a blockbuster audience, clap at the end movie. It's an experience. I think that is definitely the vibe it goes for. And that is not the kind of film that the average audience is going to appreciate. So he did his job very well and explained what the movie kind of is and where its faults are. And then let the audience decide for themselves if they're taking the ticket for the ride like I did. So I think give him a B.
I think that's fair. And when it comes to Roger, this is the problem I have with his review. He nails all the key points, but he weighed heavy on the it looks good, it looks good, it looks good. He was trying to find a recommendation for people to see this movie. And when we have a critic, especially in the 80s, saying this movie looks fantastic, that is going to scream blockbuster. That's going to scream special effects. That's going to scream a lot of different things to attract people to go see a movie. And it didn't take until what Gene said for him to react to it. So it is a very safe review for Roger. But after responding to Gene's take on it, he did add a little bit more to it. So it's hard for me to give him a solid review based on his first impressions because it came across as more complimentary than it did criticizing a lot of the flaws. So I have to give him probably a solid 2.5 stars on it.
Okay, yeah, middle of the road for that, for sure. And this is a genre that neither of them really like. They were not very kind to fantasy movies, especially during this era. And I think that is a mixed bag of appreciation for different audiences. You know, like I said, there's people who think Kroll is amazing, and there's people who think it's boring. I think, personally, it's boring. But then if you think about movies like Time Bandits, or even later in the 80s with Willow, there are audiences for those. I do enjoy this genre, even though I'm not, like, married to it. For me, this is more of me appreciating Boorman and the craziness that he brings to the screen in all of his movies, more than it is I'm a fan of Excalibur.
I get it. And again, this genre isn't my cup of tea, but Boorman did bore me in this one. So it really just doubled down on it. So, but again, just like war movies, it's a one and done for me when it comes to this. You have to do an exceptional job at this genre to really keep me bought into a movie like this.
Okay, so for next week, we are bringing Justin's pick. And again, a love it or hate it amongst many people. He's bringing 1991's Hudson Hawk starring Bruce Willis. I can't believe we haven't done this yet. Here we are like on episode 83 or 84, and we haven't hit Hudson Hawk yet. We're pulling out all the stops because Hudson Hawk is definitely a love it or hate it film. And I can't wait to hear what our critics have to say about it.
I think that's one that we know. I think we know each other well enough to know where we're going to go with this movie, and it's been in our back pocket. So it's one that I can't wait to have the conversation with. I think it's going to be a great combo.
Absolutely. And then after that, we will have a special guest. We'll be doing our Star Trek V episode. Again, another hot topic of conversation, not only for Siskel and Ebert, but for Star Trek fans. Very divisive, and I'm bringing on a Star Trek aficionado onto the show for that one. So, some good episodes coming up. Now, don't forget that we will love to hear from you and your audience suggestions. We've already got a few in the bag. Please send more. You can suggest them either on our YouTube channel or on our Instagram page. You can find me, Antonio, over at thecultworthy.com, the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast on Instagram and on Facebook. And you can find my friend Justin over at
The Movie Wire Podcast and themoviewire.com.
And we will see you next week.
See you next week.